It's nice to see you again as we continue on with our Making a Deal series. And usually the very first document that you're going to see is going to be what we call a non-disclosure agreement, or some people call it a confidentiality agreement. What's the purpose of that? It's because in most transactions, the seller is going to be disclosing a lot of information, financials, tax returns, contracts, etc. And the sellers rightfully should be concerned to make sure that that information is not used by a potential buyer for other purposes. Maybe they're going to be a competitor down the road. So the non-disclosure is to make sure that information is held in confidence by the buyer's representatives, for no purpose other than assessing the deal. Another document you will get on quite a few deals, it's not necessarily required every time, is a letter of intent. And what that is making sure is that between the buyer and the seller, there's a basic meeting in the minds on some of the biggest deal points, such as purchase price, what's going to be included in the deal, etc. For the most part, this is a non-binding document until you actually get to the purchase agreement. But it may have certain things which are binding in it, such as an exclusive negotiating period where the buyer and the sellers won't negotiate with anyone else. So I said, not in all deals, but it can be an important one to flesh out, are the parties basically moving toward potentially a deal? They have enough agreement on the key terms. Yes, normally it does lead to more documents. And due diligence is in many ways a buyer kicking the tires of the business, getting to know more about the business. Is it consistent with what the sellers represented to them or summaries of the business that they have gotten? That's where they are looking at some of those documents we're referring to under the NDA to see how is the business doing, what type of cash flow, how many employees, what are the critical contracts, etc. So it's important. And usually it does deal with a fair amount of paper at that stage. It can also be the other side of the coin too, which is the seller is doing due diligence on the buyer, where they want to know what's the buyer's background, their financial capability, and just do they think they'll be a good fit for the business. So all that is involved in the due diligence. Without a doubt, the most important document is the asset purchase agreement, or if it's a stock deal, the stock purchase agreement. That is where so many of the various pieces come together and you have the critical components of the deal in it, and it is a binding document. So you will have your purchase price in it, representations and warranties about the business that the seller is giving. You will describe how the deal is, when it's supposed to close, contingencies in it, and many, many other provisions. So that is the one that takes usually the longest to negotiate, to get documented, revisions back and forth, but it is critical to the deal. It is the linchpin. Well, you are so right that the deal doesn't happen without the payment being there, without the money. And usually that will involve outside financing, and you'll have third-party lenders, sometimes guaranteed by the SBA, Small Business Administration, and that's where the lion's share of the funding will come from. And so with that, you're going to have a lot of documents back and forth between the buyer and the lender, which will ultimately hopefully lead to loan agreement, promissory notes, other security documents, etc., and a lot of information which is supplied by the buyer to the lender. You may have certain deals as well where the seller is doing some of the financing, and the seller may take back a promissory note for either part or all the purchase price. And the seller in turn will then have usually a promissory note back from the buyer documenting what that dollar amount is that they are going to receive payments on over time. A good question. Yeah, both for an outside lender or if it's seller financing, you are normally going to be seeing a security agreement. And the security agreement basically provides that the assets of the business, be it equipment, inventory, accounts receivable. All those things serve as security to make sure that the underlying loan is paid. Sometimes then you will also have personal guarantees from the buyer or from other entities, corporations of the buyer, etc., securing the loan or loans. And then sometimes lenders will also want deeds of trust on other real property that the buyer may own. And so it can be a variety of collateral that's used depending upon the particular deal. Yes, there are a number of other critical documents, and depending upon the particular deal, but you will usually have real property in some shape or form, whether the seller's been leasing property or owns real property that the business is housed in. And so that may involve a sale agreement of that real property or an assignment of the lease to the buyer or a new lease entered into by the buyer. And that's a very important part of the deal. You may have other critical contracts which have to be assigned over as part of the sale of the business. And so you have consents from third parties or assignment documents for that. Normally, when you have a sale of goodwill that goes with the business, the buyer rightfully is also going to want a covenant not to compete, because they want to make sure if we are paying good money to buy the business and its goodwill, that the seller won't go down the street and be able to set up a competing business. So normally you will have a covenant not to compete prohibiting that type of conduct from the seller. You may also have a consulting or training agreement where the seller agrees for a period of time after the sale closes that they are going to train the buyer or consult, provide various services. And this might go for days, weeks, months, even years, depending upon the types of services and how critical the seller has been to the business, their particular expertise. So all of those are things that you will see, along with at times you may have a release from the seller where they release any claims they might have against the business. Sometimes we will see that. So those are all the types of documents you will also see as part of deals. Yes, the escrow will have quite a few documents. The major one we'll talk about here briefly is escrow instructions. Usually those will tie into the purchase agreement, and it's the instructions that what the escrow has to follow in fulfilling their role is acting as a third party, in a sense neutral party. They're helping to facilitate the exchange of money, the actual title to assets and other things. The instructions lay that out. If it is what we call a bulk sale escrow, which we won't go into the details of that right now, other than to say there are particular types of businesses that have a lot of inventory, or restaurants that a particular bulk sale transfer process is used. It is to provide some protection to the buyer against liabilities of the seller. That has a whole nother set of documents normally, which the escrow will be processing. Well, you're right. There are more documents with that. The closing is what the parties have been working for, usually by that time for some months to get to. And that is the actual transfer of the money and in turn transfer of title to the assets that time. So it's critical. It's the culmination of the deal. And a lot of those other documents we've been referencing, such as the covenant not to compete, various assignment things, etc., those which may have been negotiated beforehand, they will actually be signed at that time and exchanged between the parties. So a lot goes on at the closing, but that's what the parties have said have been working for all those months. Thank you for joining us again as we had another episode of Making a Deal. I hope you enjoyed it.